Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Feldenkrais Awareness Summit. My name is Lavinia Plonka, and I'm your co-host for this emotional intelligence track, which is one of my favorite subjects to talk about. The relationship between our feelings or emotions, our sensations, our movement, and our thoughts is something that is an integral component of the Feldenkrais method. And I'm delighted today to be having the opportunity to interview one of my teachers. Jeff Haller is a master Feldenkrais trainer. He actually trained with Moshe Feldenkrais and has been conducting trainings and teachings since 1983 or so. He's also a transpersonal psychologist who has done a lot of work integrating the ideas of psychology into the work of Moshe Feldenkrais. He spent 20 years as a martial artist, has had a long meditation practice, and has combined all of that to create very unique trainings. Right now, he's the director of what he calls the Feldenkrais Training Academy, which integrates a lot of his ideas in with Moshe Feldenkrais's work. And today we're going to be speaking about something that's very close to Jeff's heart, which is the concept of emotional dignity. So welcome, Jeff. It's really good to see you.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
So, well, let's just start right away with this idea of emotional dignity. Maybe you can expand upon that a little bit, and we can take it from there.
Well, maybe the best way is to give a small example from a recent client that I've had, who came in as a result of some very serious injuries as a result of mountain biking. And in the process of working with her, it's like it's a common sort of an idea, peeling the onion. But as we go further and further in working with her, the physical injuries are clearing up relatively quickly. But now when I work with her, I touch her and it's like you can sense when you touch her, like she's wearing a fabric. It's like there's a particular tone that she maintains within herself. And in one of our recent sessions when I was working with her, it became very, very clear that this tension, this excessive tension, wasn't as a result of the injuries that she suffered when she was falling off her bicycle. It came from something really very much deeper. And the person revealed to me that when she was 7 years old, her mother disowned her, and that she lived her life in boarding schools. And that since that time, she had been engaged in self-protective, very deeply emotionally self-protective processes. And that these emotional self-defensive processes lead to a particular kind of tension that she carries with her at all times. She is alert. She is alert to her environment. She's alert to her surroundings. And she is wounded in a way that at the time that she was wounded, she didn't have the resources necessary to meet the moment. So she did what every person does who doesn't have the resources to meet the moment. We call these traumatic experiences. A trauma is a moment where we don't have the resources to meet the moment. If we had the internal resources, we wouldn't be traumatized by the event. So now what we're working with is for her to find what it's like to be supported in her skeleton, supported in herself, supported in such a way that she's not maintaining the extra, Moshe would call it the phasic muscular control, the voluntary muscular control that supplants the simple way that we can support ourselves. Now, as we go through each session now, and she finds herself becoming quieter and quieter and more internally able to sense her own confidence in her own support, what's beginning to happen is that the ego defenses are beginning to dissolve. The default mode network, that means that's fancy big words for the way that we come to experience the preferences of ourselves as a result of our history. The way it doesn't take long in our conditioning before the tones and tensions and the difficulties that we experience become the fabric that we wear. We live our history. And so as that fabric begins to become more elastic and her internal sense of dimension begins to open, she's going through, I think in her words, she would call it a transformational process. But the thing that's most clear is that she actually walks and moves with a different kind of dignity. It's like she's becoming regal within herself. And she's carrying herself into the meetings and the work that she does. And she's carrying herself into moments and events. She's handling situations with her neighbors that have previously been difficult because she has a refined sense of self that is not defensive, but resourceful. And so I would call that to be, I would say that's in the realm of emotional dignity, where one finds the resources that are latent within ourselves, begins to bring them to the surface. A sense of well-being begins to appear, a sense of, I like to think of this in terms of composure, that a person finds within themselves a greater capacity to be composed in difficult times. And I would say that that's health. When we look at Moshe's definition of health, Moshe said, health is the ability to live our unavowed dreams. Another way of saying that is health is having the resources to meet the current changing moment, the uncertain moment, with enough resources that we can thrive in the moment, rather than having to defend ourselves or to be self-protective in some way. I would say that's emotional dignity.
Well, let me see if I can remember all of my impressions as I was listening to you and unpack some of these ideas that you've brought forward. The first thing that jumped out for me, and you mentioned it in passing, but you really reminded me of the term that we use a lot of times, your history is your biology. That every experience that I have is in some way reflected in my carriage and my holding and in all of those qualities that sort of, you called it fabric. It's invisible to me, but it's definitely visible to others, which I thought was really interesting. And then I just thought it was so interesting. I literally just finished a class before I came on with you, where we were speaking at the end of the class at the difference between the quality of being regal. We literally used that word, and the idea of walking as if you're with your chest puffed up, acting regal versus being regal, and the quality of moving from, a sense of centeredness versus a sense of, for lack of a better word, pomposity or upper chest tension. And so, so the question for me becomes this question of how we even understand the word dignity. So I loved when you started to speak about this idea of composure, because a person doesn't have to have a particular posture to be dignified. But if a person has a quality of composure and ease, and as you put it, have resources, then they give off a feeling or a quality of dignity. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Another word I use is self-possession. There's a profound sense of self-possession. It is not bombastic. It does not have to show off. It is quiet. There's a kind of a reserve. There's an immediate availability to meet what's changing in their lives with the best word really is dignity. Really to meet the moment with from a sense of information that comes from within outward. It's not reactive. It is very responsive to the moments. And that person who can do that can sit in the place, and this is a little bit Zen, but of the place of not this and not that. They have a moment where they're not caught up in the duality of the moment, of this or that. They can sit in the moment that of between stimulus and response. Uh, they have choice. It goes very much along with Moshe's notion of what's good posture. The good posture is the freedom to move in any direction without hesitation or preparation. Well, that must be, in fact, in the case with our thinking. It must be the case with our ability to be with our emotions and to act. It must be with our ability to intend actions and to carry out motor plans that meet the moment rather than just have our habits subsume us, to overtake us, and have them just fly forward in such a way that we're unconscious of them. That's the very definition of the term neurosis, actually, is to simply have your habits. Obviously, we want to have our habits to be strong and useful, but we also want to be able to inhibit our habits to fit the moment.
So, this place of not this and not that, I just want to talk about that a little bit, because to me, sometimes people get caught in the middle, not this and not that. So to me, that connects up a little bit with, sort of the freeze part of fight, flight, freeze.
Yes.
And when you were speaking about Moshe's definition of a good posture or good actor and this ability to be able to move in every direction, there's also the implication that I can do it in the moment, like spontaneous, to be spontaneous, which to me, how do you reconcile the ability to spontaneously respond to a situation, but also to sit between the two choices or the three choices or whatever, to be in the middle? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, this idea of being between stimulus and response is Viktor Frankl's idea. He mentioned it, and uh, obviously, if you look where Viktor Frankl came from, you understand that he was in a destitute situation in his life without. Uh, so the ability to choose freedom within. Now, a person who's had a freeze response doesn't have the ability to choose what's happening within themselves. They've already calibrated their amygdala. They've already calibrated themselves for anything from the external world that will stimulate them. The term that people use, and I think overuse these days, is trigger, to be triggered by the events in the world, which is something that I'm not particularly fond of, because as soon as you're triggered, you're taken over by the world with little ability to act spontaneously. You can't unpull a trigger. You can't unshoot a bullet. And so I don't particularly like that term, even though it's the term that's used so much these days. But the moment that you've been hijacked by your emotions, or you've been overwhelmed by something in the experience that leads to your necessity for self-preservation, that leads you to the necessities for self-protection. And the limbic system's entire job is to maintain our sense of security and safety. Its job is to scan the world and to see to it that we are safe in every single way possible. So in this case, the freeze response, which is developed again when a person doesn't have the resources, they must revert, they must go into some form of self-protective process to maintain their sense of their life. So, and that becomes deeply calibrated into a person. They are scanning the environment for what it takes for them to be safe. This freeze response is not a question of choice. It's very different than to be in the place between this and that, not this, not that. It is not a freeze response. You can easily find this place of not this, not that. If you simply close your eyes for just the slightest moment, and you simply place your fingertip on your forehead, and just touch either your forehead, wherever it is, and simply move it slightly to the right, and so that you know that you're touching the right. And go back slowly, 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 just the smallest movement, and go back to the place that's not right and not left. And stay there for a moment. Just really find within yourself the place within yourself that's not right and not left. And then simply shift to the left, the tiniest bit, so that you know it's to the left. And come back again to the place that's not right and not left. And sit there in the moment. And from this point, look into the right and experience the right of yourself. And come back to this point of attention that's not this and not that. And then shift your attention to the left of yourself and sense the left of yourself. And you can begin to calibrate and sense for yourself the difference in your own experience between left and right. And you can also come to this place within yourself of the quietness that's not right and not left, not this and not that. And so that you can become observant and use this. I use this as a practice all the time, and I teach in my lessons oftentimes for people to come to this place that's not this and not that. And stay for a moment, just simply stay in the point that's not this and not that, and just tune into this experience for a moment and sense what happens to your internal sense of dimension, what happens to your mental activity, what happens to the thoughts that are coming and going. Observe how observant you can become. Yeah.
So several things happen when I do something like that. And I'm trying not to let my sort of monkey mind take over into the story of it. But there is a possibility that I become involved in simply trying to stay with the center. There's also the possibility of increasing the field of attention so that I am within that center, but I can include this and that,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Or there's a quality I can create of tension of trying to block this and that and try to be with this. So, trying to find sort of the blend of those possibilities. I mean, I see your point, and I see the value of an exercise like that for sure. But it is interesting that depending on your attitude, again,
Yes.
it's the attitude,
Yeah.
it can be an expansive or a contracting experience, right? I can also become overly fascinated with the difference between this and that. as I'm
Yeah.
exploring that.
All this is just a simple example of what it's like to be still for a moment
Hmm.
between,
Right,
and not be identified with this or that.
right. I get it.
We become profoundly identified with ourselves. Yeah.
So the other question I have is, it's actually not a question, it's a reflection based on what you had said about the triggers,
Yes.
because it reminded me, and I'm not sure which book it was in, but it reminded me how Feldenkrais kind of likened the feeling of that situation to kind of like watching a meltdown, a nuclear meltdown, that once you flip the trigger, you can do nothing but watch what's taking place. And our work allows us the possibility to recognize the things that are building up to that moment, to become more aware of ourselves, that so that we're not taken by surprise, we're not thrown, so to speak. We have resources before we're triggered, because once we're triggered, we're triggered. Can you
Right.
say something to that?
Yeah. I think that's the brilliance of the awareness through movement process. I think it is a clear, concrete process of learning to take something that is palpable. You can watch the intention to move. You can watch the unfolding of a motor plan, and so it's concrete. You can watch the earliest moment, the where the slow twitch fibers, the muscle fibers are obviously graded into different fiber types, but the initial fiber type that's involved with preparing the skeleton to act,
Mm.
you can become so distinct that you can actually begin to watch the motor plan begin to organize the skeleton for any action. In other words, you can become very, very, very clear in a palpable way to watch the earliest moment that your intention is spread and the way that that spread passes into your entire system during the preparation for action. If you were to try to do the same thing with meditation, it's much more difficult in the sense that you have to start watching the rising of your thought, which is not nearly as palpable. It's not nearly as concrete. Eventually, you can learn to do that. There's a teacher, a Buddhist teacher named Buddhasa Bhikkhu, and he wrote a book called Heartwood of the Bodhi Tree. And in the book, he says, how many times are we reincarnated? And he says, the answer is, you're reincarnated every single time you become identified with yourself. And he says, so how do you keep yourself from being identified with your thought or with your intention or with being married to your habit or whatever it is? How do you go about this process? He says, in your moment of silence and watching, you can watch yourself about ready to occupy your identity right before it happens. You can watch it as it's arising within you. You can become so clear and distinct that you can catch the very earliest moment that it begins to arise. Or you can be in the state where it never arises. Now, I have no idea what that state is like because I live my life in my identity all the time. I don't claim to have anything other than living a practice of observing these rising moments and to watch the rising of my emotions. The thing that's happened to me over the years is that I'm not very, I don't get subsumed by them because I watch them and I know that I'm not going to be harmed by them. I'm not worried about fear. I'm not worried about pain, emotional pain at this point in time, because I know that I'm not blackmailed by them. I know that I'm not going to lose myself if I experience them, which gives me a particular internal resolution, a particular strength, a resilience to handle situations that I think that, again, has to do with emotional dignity and emotional intelligence. That it's not that we're going to be in the state where these things are not going to happen to us. It's a question, as you said, how early can I detect the beginning of these moments and how much resolution do I have within myself? How much internal strength do I have to meet my own experience in such a way that I'm not violent to myself or protective of myself in such a way that it interferes with my ability to act with a particular kind of freedom and kindness to myself and others? The only way that you can become compassionate with yourself is to absolutely accept that you cannot have had any other life than the life you've had. You cannot have had a different birth. You can't have had different parents. You can't have been raised in a different society. You can't have been raised in a different culture. You can't have had any other experience other than the experience you have. And that experience is written in every single moment, in every pore of yourself, in every single way. And that experience is continually engaged with the environment that you're living in and participating and co-creating the environment. The environment is creating you and you're creating the environment. That is continuous. That is always continuous. The question is whether, and Moshe poses this very, very cleverly. He says, what do we do this work for? It's just so that we can become comfortable. Yeah. I would like to live my life in greater comfort, enjoy the quality of my own life. I was a maniac. Lavinia, I was a maniac. Moshe would come around in Amherst. He would kick me on the toe. He would say to me, stupid athlete. He called me the athlete. And he'd say to me, stupid athlete, I take better care of you than you can take care of yourself. And I said, Moshe, how could you possibly do that? I'm 32 years old or 30 years old, however old I was at the time when we started, 30, 31. I was a black belt. I was a PhD candidate. I had played varsity basketball. I had given myself all kinds of ideas that I was more than I actually ever could possibly be. I had inflated myself out of the necessity to inflate myself in order to cover up deeply rooted insecurities. And that was the way I sought meaning in the things that I did. And I left the training and I built an emporium for movement arts, 9,000 square foot space in Seattle, where I had Aikido, Tai Chi, Judo, advanced martial arts, yoga, Feldenkrais. I taught, I taught 7 classes a week in between my Aikido classes and my ATM classes. I saw 35 people a week and I administered the building. I was there 16 to 18 hours every single day. And finally it dawned on me, I have no clue as to how to take care of myself. I knew how to care for the conditioning that I had, that where my well-being was based on what I could accomplish. But I finally recognized I don't know what it means to care for myself. And if we look at Moshe's work very, very carefully, we can see that his entire work, my interpretation is his entire work is to bring us face to face with this paradigm, the paradigm of where my well-being is based on what I can accomplish, as opposed to how do I turn my attention and begin to care for myself. And the entire process of awareness through movement, to me, is a process of helping a person understand what it is to be gentle with yourself, to care for yourself, and to begin to refine yourself from the inside out, not to live in the parasitic, unpleasant patterns of movement that we've established based on the need to protect ourselves, or to the calibration that we talked about of the amygdala, that sense of awareness that's continually looking for a sense of well-being through outward meaning, outward expression. You know? It's so different to have your expression appear in the beauty of yourself, to have it appear. It's completely different.
Well, I just have to ask you a couple of questions about some of the things that you've said, just for my own understanding, because 2 things. If the purpose, if health is the ability to realize my avowed and my unavowed dreams,
Yes.
let's say I have a dream. I have a dream.
Yes.
I want to be a world-class basketball player. I want to be a concert violinist.
Yes.
And then on the other side, you say that I need to be gentle with myself and not be invested in accomplishment. But that's fine if I'm independently wealthy and I can do awareness through movement lessons all day long and listen to myself all day long. But let's be practical. If I want to experience something in the world, whether it's that I want to change things for other people, I want to help them, or I want to be at the top of my field, that does not have to be the result of compulsion. That does not have to be the result of ego insecurity. So
Absolutely.
how do I let me just finish this thought, because, to me, you say I worked 16 to 18 hours a day, but if a person is enjoying themselves working 16 to 18 hours a day and they find pleasure in that, let's just refine that a little bit so that we can allow those of us who like to work
I like to work.
permission.
I like to work. Clearly, it's a question of the process, the very nature of the. Look at Moshe. Moshe loved to work. I mean, the man was. I mean, there was. I mean, his house was a library with a bed in it, and every book had been read, and you open the books, and every margin had his notes in it, and extraordinary in his ability and his curiosity and the process by which he did it. The question is whether you're driven unconsciously by the quest in order to prove yourself as worthwhile, as opposed to knowing within yourself that it's worthwhile for you to bring forth that life force within yourself. If it's driven neurotically, if it's driven out of habit, out of the necessity to gain some measure that you need the external world to give you, to give you your sense of meaning, then I think it deserves examination. It deserves to be looked at. If you are profoundly awake in your ability to bring forth something that's meaningful and potent to you, then blessings, 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 because it's not harmful to yourself. You're not going to do it with the sense that you're going to do it at all costs. How many, so let's take an example. I've worked with many triathletes over the years. Many triathletes. And they will literally destroy themselves. They have an urgency to be able to finish a triathlon. Swimming 2.5 miles, running 26 miles, biking 125 miles, whatever the Ironman thing is. And you'll see that their entire well-being is based on oh, shoot. What's the brain chemical? Lavinia, help me.
Which one? Adrenaline?
No, not adrenaline. The one that makes you feel really good.
Oh, endorphins you're talking about.
Endorphins, yeah, the endorphin rush. Yeah, and they are so, some of them I'll give you the best example I can give you, right? This is the best example. I have a woman come to me in her early 50s, beautiful, strong, athletic woman. She's been playing soccer since she was in her teens. Her left lower leg angles outward about between 10 and 15 degrees. And she's in absolute excruciating pain. And she's been sent to me by another client of mine. And in the course of a couple sessions, she walks out of here without significant pain. Yeah. And she's able to walk. She's able to do her daily life things. She's able to find support through her skeleton in such a way that she's not engaging the necessity for self-preservation. That's what pain is. It's protection from further harm. So she has a sense that she's doing okay. So she comes back, we have another session. She feels really nice. And then she goes out and plays 80 minutes in a soccer game. Yeah, 80 minutes. Her team that she was on didn't have enough players, so she finds a way to rationalize to herself that it's going to be okay. She's feeling good, which is oftentimes the case when people leave here. They feel good, so then they say, oh, I can get back to running again. I can go back on my walks. And then they immediately assume that they can go back to the level that they had before. They don't have to develop themselves back to. They go back to their imagined idea of where they were before. So she comes back to me and she's in excruciating pain again. And at the end of the session, she gets up and she looks at me from a place within herself with a kind of benign, beatific quality in her face. And she looks at me and says, I have never felt this much happiness. Completely, like a completely profound shift within herself to happiness. And her next statement is, but I enjoy playing soccer so much. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Right there is this place of that she enjoys, and I can agree with her. I get up in the mornings, I'm 70 years old, and I go play basketball with a bunch of guys. 2 or 3 mornings a week, I go play basketball. Why? I love the movement. I love the force. I love the game. I like the strategies. I like the timing. I like the attempts. I've got no jump shot, sarcopenia has completely taken over. Sarcopenia means the loss of fast twitch muscle fiber as we age. Yeah, so there's no jump shot left, but I love the game. Yeah, there's a pleasure in playing. Yeah, there's no question. I choose to play, right? She couldn't choose, right? In that sense. But the pleasure of the game is that's where her family is, that's where how she socializes, those are her friends, everything that is meaningful for her in the way that she's lived her life. She doesn't know how to sense that happiness has a value that's at least equal to that pleasure. She doesn't know yet. And that's what many people don't really know, is how to value that the internal qualities of tranquility, peace, serenity, openness, availability, resource, as opposed to the drive to succeed. If the succession comes out of the beauty of what's alive within us, it's extraordinary. It's truly extraordinary. You know? I think it's a distinction that we have to make, because I think that's the difference between being driven and being dignified, being resourceful. There's where I would say health is. I would say that's the source of where your unavowed dreams can appear. It's because you have the resources from which they can appear.
So, it's interesting what you bring up about you playing basketball and, this woman wanting to continue to play soccer.
Yeah.
There's a question I have from a neurological perspective, not to go too far off on a limb here, but it has to do with sort of our own, you talked about I get identified every moment, and I become whatever it is that particular situation calls for. And so I have found that for people who engaged in an art form or a sport when they were young for a very long time,
Yeah.
that even as they age, and I can speak for myself as well, that when we have the opportunity to dive back into it, even at the level that we're at, okay, no jump shots, I don't do dive rolls anymore on
Yeah.
concrete anyway.
Yes.
But something happens in our body where there's almost like a youthification process that happens because we are doing what we love
Yeah.
and what we know well. Is sort of like the neurons go, right, I know the court, I know the strategy, and something allows us to become younger. So going back to this woman with the soccer, and I don't know how long, whether you've continued working with her or not, but is it not possible that she could find that place where she could enjoy soccer from where she is now?
Yes, I would hope so. I never saw her again after that.
Ah, pity.
Yeah, I thought I was deeply disappointed, actually, because I thought that I was hoping that, I mean, if I go play basketball and I know that I'm potentially going to harm myself, I can sense my knees a little tweaky or my back's tweaky, or I have no problem with saying, okay, guys, time for me to get off the court now. You know? And so I'm vigilant in the sense of being there in a way that I can be expressive and have fun, and yet also not at the point that I'm going to harm myself. I don't care to harm myself. Now I'm playing a rigorous game. A lot of these guys are in their 30s and 40s, and so there are bumps and bangs, and and that's a part of the game. I realize that, but for the most part, I also know, guys, right now is not a good time. I can sense that my breath isn't coming easily. I need more time to adjust to the change from anaerobic to aerobic to the aerobic state. I'm going to take the time to go off to the side and give myself the time to adjust. I don't need to give myself a heart attack. Yeah, I mean, I'm being facetious, but these things. So part of it is to find the situation to be pleasurable in such a way. But you know, if I was to go back into an Aikido class, which I did for 20 years, if I was to go back to that, then I would also want to have the same kind of caring for myself, which was to be there in the place where the thing that's most important is the discovery, the continued curiosity, the continued ability to discern qualities. I mean, that's part of the workshop that we're doing. I'm going to be doing in August. Yeah.
So, oh gosh, I just lost my thought, but it'll come back in a second. It has to do with this woman
Yes.
who said that to you and then never came back.
Yes.
And that struck me about the how our work relates to self-image.
Yes.
That in some way she was unable to reconcile those two aspects of self-image in some way, right? And so, and I think all of us who are Feldenkrais practitioners have had situations where we've worked with people who had been professional athletes or who were so wanting to cling to playing in their old way that once they realized that something in their self-image had to shift in order to be happy or comfortable or healthy, that they were unable to continue with this work. How can we begin to open that door to help people see that the next step is not giving up who you are?
Well, I think what has to happen is that people have to recognize. I think you have to be able to tune into what Stern called the core self-image. And what that means is that, look, if my self-image has been based on being raised into my family who wants me to be a part of their family, and I've been raised in a particular culture, society, and then the most important thing is I've been raised in gravity. In other words, I had to go through all the processes of learning how to function in the world of gravity. And I acquired this for myself. That is the basis in one sense. If you go into Piaget's work, you can see how the core self-image is developed. Ultimately, if we're going to make a real change for people, that core self-image has to be changed, because you can't just do patchwork work on top of a faulty image. You have to actually go to the foundation that the person is living in and help them come to a place of realization of an internal integrity that has always been there, and have them come to realize that, and then have them build their life out of that newly established basement, that newly established foundation for themselves. Because otherwise, anything you do is patchwork now, and the patchwork feels good, and they can appreciate the patchwork in the sense that it, you know, for a few moments they leave and they go, wow, this is really nice, or I'm moving more freely, but it hasn't essentially changed the way that I'm going to be in the world with myself. And I think part of our difficulty as Feldenkrais practitioners is, if we really truly are agents of transformation, we're really going to help people recover their physical integrity after serious injuries, really help them recover their dignity after a lifetime of emotional wounds, because all of us have been, and to find a core within ourselves that we're going to bring to life, and let that become the living self-image. As practitioners, we have to be able to be at that depth ourselves in the way that we're sitting with our clients and with our students and with the people that come to us. I mean, there's a particular gravitas. You have it just in the way that you ask questions, just in the way that you experience. And I know you from a long time. So I know that there's a particular gravitas that you have. And so people, when they're around you, they have you as they can reflect themselves, and you reflect to them in such a way that they can begin to reflect inside themselves. Our practitioners have to continue in that maturation for themselves. We can't just patchwork people together. We have to help people profoundly establish another underlying basement from which their activities are going to come from, which means for them to find out what what's been there all along. Happiness is intrinsic. All the emotions are intrinsic. Being peaceful within yourself is intrinsic. Having a particular kind of curiosity and the capacity to learn, that's intrinsic. We don't have to learn how to learn. We have to remember the capacity we have to learn. But we don't have to learn how to learn. That's intrinsic within us. It's in every single fiber of a human being, that we are continually engaged in the environment and continually capable of refining ourselves relative to the change that's taking place in the environment around us. Yeah. Now, how do we utilize that? We don't, that's, a child knows it.
Well, just because something is intrinsic in the sense that we had it as children doesn't mean that we don't have to learn how to learn now, I think. I mean, Moshe said, my work, I don't teach movement, I teach learning. Why would he be teaching learning if that wasn't something we've forgotten?
Yeah, and I would even begin to question the term of calling ourselves teacher or Moshe teaching learning. I would say that Moshe created the environment in which a person reflects in themselves and they learn from within themselves. I think even our language about our method can go through a review. Because ultimately, if you look at the very first talk that Moshe gives when he starts the Amherst training, he says, look, I have no notes. The only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to establish an environment for learning, and I'm going to do that by asking questions. And ultimately, that's what we as practitioners learn to do, is to create an environment in which a person in their own internal capacity makes reflections within themselves and comes to a new set of possibilities and conclusions and create significant amount of variability, but it is the environment itself. And our job is to create a really, really rich environment that invites people into that level of variation and attention and discrimination within themselves. I mean, the forebrain has major capacities, but its first and foremost capacity is to make distinctions. And it is the source from where imagination, spontaneity, and curiosity are derived for ourselves as human beings. But until we're in the state of really, really being able to make distinctions, and so the art of making distinctions, reflecting in the environment to people that they have the capacity to make distinctions in and of themselves, if they're in that point of making distinctions, they're already within their own internal milieu, their own internal environment for where learning is taking place. And they can't not learn it. The question is how long they maintain it. Whether they take a rocket and they have enough internal capacity within themselves to establish an orbit out of their usual gravitational field. And then the question is, do they have enough integrity within themselves to keep expanding the orbit, or does the orbit decay and then they find themselves pulled back in by their own inertia, by their own history, by their own habits, back into the gravitational field that has always served them, and it served them brilliantly. They had to have it. Every single way that a person has protected themselves, compensated themselves, was and is still necessary until they find a better way of doing. And we have to appreciate that. We have to help people really, really appreciate profoundly how intelligent they were in being able to maintain and preserve their life, maintain their ability to orient themselves, maintain their ability to interact, to serve themselves, make a living, whatever they had to do to get them eventually, and whatever the calling was within them that gets them into our office. Because oftentimes it's an internal calling. There's a particular magnetization where they're asking questions that they cannot find answers to anywhere else in the world. Their meditation hasn't brought them. Their psychotherapy hasn't brought them. Whatever it is, their physical therapist hasn't brought them to the place where they can initiate within themselves their own self-generated learning process that brings them to another level of peace or composure or dignity. I
So,
guess.
sorry, am
I
I
guess.
interrupting? Are you
Well,
still
no,
going at it?
well, I guess I got on a rant there. So,
No, no, it's good. That's why we're having you on this summit, because you riff well.
well,
Um, but you when you were talking about the rocket moving out of the gravitational field, several images came up for me. One of them was this idea that we're eternally recurring, right? Ouspensky's idea of eternal recurrence, but that if it's moving in a spiral, that maybe each time I come back to my place, it's not a crash landing of the rocket, but maybe it's a little bit higher level or something. And then it reminded me also of this idea that Moshe talked about, where my story of my life
right.
is always going to be there. Whatever happened to me as a child or whatever, it's always going to be there. But my relationship to it and how it informs me and how I can learn from it can, so that it's not like my rocket goes up and then I crash each time, but maybe I have a little rocket that's moving a little bit different. It returns to the same spot, but in a different level, for lack of a better word.
Yeah,
Can you?
I agree with that. I think I think that's the actual maturation process. I think that's how we temper ourselves. But I think you have to, for example, I think you have to have enough personal, something internal that has to be there enough that you're willing to go outside of your history, your heritage, to end up in a Feldenkrais practitioner's office. You have to be willing to go outside of some box within you, unless there's some calling, and you're called because you have an affinity.
Or you have to be really desperate. I
Desperate.
always I always joke when people come to see me
Right,
that, I'm the last stop. I'm the place where they
right,
can't pronounce the name, they've never heard of it, they don't know how it works, and it's not covered by insurance.
right,
So the reason that they're coming here is because they've tried everything else.
right. And they still have to be able to. Then they have to justify themselves to everybody around themselves, and decide whether they're going to, whoever it is that says, "Oh, that's a ridiculous idea," or it's still find within themselves, there was something there that was such a value for me. I have to go back
Hmm.
and defy that. That's the person who's not going to be pulled back into that gravitational field.
Right, right.
And if you're in a partnership, either your partner has to be extraordinarily strong and supportive of you, or they'll do the very best because they don't want to have to go on that growth process that they're going to go through. So unless they're willing to or have their own means to grow or to be self-possessed themselves in whatever way, in whatever maturity that they have, for the most part, the environment will try to pull you back rather than support you. Now the question is if you have the support, but you have to have the measure within yourself to say, this is important to me, and I'm going to. That means that's what I mean by expand the orbit.
Hmm.
I'm going to continue to put myself in this. There's no doubt that the tempering process for maturation means that we have to be in the cauldron over and over and over again. We have to have the heat. The Japanese sword, the katana, the history of how they were made. They took very, very poor iron ore off of a beach, a particular beach in Japan, and then they would heat it. And then once it was heated, then they would fold it, and then they would beat it, and then they would heat it, and then they would fold it, and they would beat it, and they would heat it and fold it and beat it until this metal became durable and extraordinarily keen, extraordinarily flexible, because they beat the impurities out of it. I consider my life to be a cauldron. In my own experience, the very nature of having to do this process to temper myself. But it also means that I cannot be blackmailed by the fears and the emotions or the thoughts of fear that I have. I have to have a particular I have to have a spine to my sword and a keenness that I have to have within myself. Again, back to dignity. There is a particular dignity that is able to meet whatever the difficulties are with a particular with grace, with with being at peace with. I mean, there's nothing, in one sense, there's nothing more difficult. I'm 70 and I watch as I'm aging the functions that want to leave. Yeah. And that, I mean, that's in all the functions. That means the mental functions, the capacities, the thinking, the ability for words to rise, the athletic abilities, the conditioning, all those things that were I once had great pride in and great capacities. I watch them. And the question is how do I sit in myself as this that was so important to me gradually diminishes, and then I watch what is coming back in its place.
Right. I think that the thing when you said sword and dignity and this feeling brings me back to the skeleton, that
Yes,
if I feel supported and organized in my skeleton, then I can maintain that dignity no matter what my age
yeah,
or my deterioration. Would you agree with that?
absolutely. I think that's again and again and again. I think that's what part of Moshe's absolute brilliance was that he really understood that if I mean there's a talk that he gives in Amherst. He says, "Why do we have a skeleton?" And it's obviously the reason to have a skeleton is to counteract the force of gravity, to be able to utilize ground forces. And he gives a brilliant mathematical definition of it. In our book, The Embodied Wisdom that Elizabeth produced, there's the talk that he gave in Amsterdam. It does not have the last page and a half of the talk. There's an appendix to that talk in which Moshe gives the mathematical derivatives on what reversibility is. And reversibility, if you go through the derivatives, is exactly the capacity to utilize ground forces in such a way that at any point in time, in any position you are in space, you have a sense of being weightless and the movement is effortless. Yeah. Now, that means that we have to utilize our skeleton in absolutely specific ways to take advantage of ground forces so that we're always counteracting the force of gravity through our skeleton. And when that happens, we live in an absolute minimal tone necessary for any action. And it is glorious.
Indeed.
It is glorious.
So Jeff, you know that in this series, this summit series that we're doing, one of the things that we're asking everyone is to offer us a favorite quote. And I know you have one, and I know it's very much related to some of the things that we've talked about. So maybe you'd like to share that with us as we're coming close to the end of our interview here.
Yeah, in oh my goodness, senior moment.
It's good
uh,
that you gave us that whole preface about being 70 first.
no, the book that Carl Ginsburg edited, Master Moves. In Master Moves, Moshe says, movement is life. Life without movement is unthinkable. Now, I think for the most part, that's misinterpreted. I mean, for the most part, life without movement is unthinkable, is interpreted as facility, biological facility, the ability to move from position to position. That's necessary. But I think that there's a deeper meaning to this. Because if I'm living a compulsive life, that means I only have one way of doing. There really isn't life. It's just compulsion. And so to ask the question of myself, what does it mean to have life? Then I must have choice. And I must be able to have the facility to engage in the moment with real resource. Then it becomes life. If all I have is compulsion, I only have one way of doing something, then Moshe would call that person a Homo sapien, but he wouldn't call him a human being. Yeah.
Interesting. It's an interesting take on the whole situation. Well, I want to thank you so much. I just want to let everyone know that Jeff has been generous enough to offer a bonus, one of his recordings on the emotions, and it's called Emotional Well-Being Through the Feldenkrais Method. And all you have to do is click on the bottom of this video, and you'll be able to get access to that recording and learn some more about what he has to say and an expansion of some of the ideas that you heard here today. So, Jeff, do you have anything that you want to say in closing before we wrap up this interview?
Well, Lavinia, it's always a pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry, it's just two-dimensional. I want to be able to put my arms around you and have a little hug or something.
No,
Or
just send me a round trip ticket, Jeff. I'll be there in a heartbeat.
oh, perfect. Well, maybe we'll just meet in the middle or somewhere. Next conference, of course, we'll have a chance.
All right, for sure, for sure.
Well, Lavinia, thank you so much for taking your time to and to engage me this way. I really appreciate it because you pushed me a little bit in some areas, and I really appreciate it because that's where I want to live.
Well, it's always fun to talk to you, and thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and I'll see you at the next interview.
Thanks, Lavinia.